and welcome to the first lecture of the Archive Online Academy dedicated to ARCHiOx. It will be, as you all know, a course of two lectures today and on the 7th of June. And I'm Costanza Blaskovic, and I work for Fondazione Giorgio Cini at the Archive Center and in the Archive project. Archive is analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Venice. And every year we organize Archive Online Academy, AOA. So courses, talks, workshop dedicated to digital preservation and enhancement of cultural heritage and digital humanities more in general. This course stems from the desire to spread and deepen the activities of ARCHiOx, born as John Barrett, Jorge Cano, and Richard Allen will explain soon after Archive. And well, the two projects, Archive and ARCHiOx, have a partner in common, Factum Foundation for Digital Technology in Preservation, which together with the colleagues from the Bodleian Libraries will deliver today's lecture. So starting today will be John Barrett, ARCHiOx Technical Lead and Senior Photographer at the Bodleian Libraries, Jorge Cano, Head of Technology at the Factum Foundation, and Richard Allen, software engineer for Bodleian Digital Library Systems and Services. So, ended these practical infos, I will really leave the floor to you and welcome again. I will be monitoring the chat also for questions from our audience. So thank you for being here and please, I'm all ears.
Okay, can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Costanza. It's a pleasure to join you from quite a warm and sunny Oxford, which is unusual for May, but I think we've got some of your Venetian sunshine today, which is really nice. And in preparing this presentation for Archive in Venice, I thought that I should share this image with you before we begin. It's from one of Oxford's most beautiful medieval manuscripts, and it depicts Marco Polo leaving Venice. And although it's a French manuscript, it was illuminated in England in around 1400. And in the picture, you'll be able to see Marco Polo twice, here standing on the shore, and here stepping into a rowing boat. And if you look closely, you can see the 4 bronze horses of the Church of San Marco in the top left of the image. So on behalf of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, thank you for allowing me to talk to you today about ARCHiOx. And let's begin. So what is ARCHiOx? ARCHiOx is an exciting project which began at the end of January last year. It's a collaborative project between the Factum Foundation and the Bodleian Libraries. And the main focus of the project has been to use prototype recording technology to capture Bodleian Library originals in 3D. The new recording system was designed and built by my colleague Jorge Cano from the Factum Foundation, and we'll be hearing from him very shortly. But before we discuss ARCHiOx further, allow me to take 5 minutes to introduce you to the Bodleian Library, which is at the heart of Oxford University. Bodleian is the 2nd largest library in the UK. It's a legal deposit library and holds approximately 13 million printed items, as well as thousands of manuscripts, many of which originate from the Middle Ages. Though some of the Bodleian's buildings date to the 15th century, the Bodleian, as we know it, was established in 1602 by Sir Thomas Bodley. The buildings which comprise the Bodleian are among the most iconic in Oxford. Here we can see the Radcliffe Camera. Behind this is the Old Schools Quad, which leads to this room, which is the 15th century Divinity School. And above the Divinity School, we have Duke Humphrey's Library, which was completed in 1480. Not far away from that is the Clarendon Building, which housed Oxford University's printing presses during the 18th and 19th century. But the majority of the Bodleian's collections are held, beg your pardon, in the building opposite, which is named the Western Library. And this is home to the Bodleian's imaging studio and to the ARCHiOx project. Bodleian is perhaps best known for its collection of medieval illuminated volumes, but it also is home to much later manuscripts. Among these are original works by J.R.R. Tolkien, Jane Austen, and Mary Shelley. Other notable treasures include 4 engrossments of Magna Carta, the first printed volume, the Gutenberg Bible, as well as original calotypes and negatives made by photographic pioneer William Henry Fox Talbot. And our collections are not only European, volumes originating from territories across the world and ranging in subject matter are represented among our vast collections. Though the Bodleian has incorporated a photographic studio for many decades, the first digital images from our collections were captured in the year 2000. There are currently over 3 million images from our collections freely available to view and download on our digital platform, Digital Bodleian. Bodleian Imaging Services currently employs 7 photographers who capture tens of thousands of images from our originals every year. Our clients include students, publishers, media organizations, as well as our own Bodleian publishing department. The majority of our digitization, though, is enabled through large-scale funded projects, which help us to systematically capture our manuscripts and early printed books. I joined the library in 2005 when high-resolution digital imaging was in its infancy. In fact, during this time, the Bodleian was still capturing color images on sheet film. Primitive scanning backs were capable of recording at high resolution, but were not capable of recording with adequate sharpness or color fidelity. But through developments in camera technology, profiling, lighting, and photographic technique, within a few years, the images which the Bodleian were making would become faithful facsimiles of the originals. Finding solutions to accurately record these uniquely difficult to capture originals has often involved a scientific and exploratory approach, designing lighting techniques to capture illuminations, for instance, which has become a focus of my work for over a decade. And also profiling to ensure that the colors of the pigments are faithfully reproduced. Ultimately, our aim is to produce images which are able to give the viewer as close an experience of consulting an original as is possible. To arrive at this point, the Bodleian has allowed me to research, experiment, document methods to ensure accuracy and consistency in our imaging. This is a document which I wrote in 2019 relating to the guidelines for digitization, with the intention of helping photographers from cultural heritage institutions better understand the content of the guidelines and suggesting methods that might assist in faithfully recording two-dimensional material. This is what we consider library material to be, two-dimensional, but of course it's not. The three-dimensional surface of manuscripts, books, and printing plates can tell us a huge amount about who made them, how they were made, and about people's interactions with them since they were made. ARCHiOx, the analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Oxford, began in January 2022. It was a project conceived by the Factum Foundation following the success of ARCHive, which our colleagues and hosts of this session have been involved with since 2018. Both ARCHive and ARCHiOx have been made possible through the incredibly generous funding support of the Helen Hamlin Trust. In essence, the aim of ARCHiOx has been to record originals from the Bodleian's collections in 3D, and the kind of 3D recording which we're talking about involves the capture of just the first few millimeters of an original surface. In other words, just the texture. These 3D recordings serve many purposes. Firstly, discovery. We can take an item which is difficult or perhaps impossible to record using conventional photography and create an image which shows just its three-dimensional surface with its color and tone completely removed. So let's take a look at a group of originals which fit this category and were among the first to be recorded for the project. So I'm going to try and switch the camera. So this is a very large copper printing plate, and it depicts the coronation of Henry VI. And it was made in the studios of the engraver James Bezier between 1786 and 1796. And as you can see, it's very highly reflective, very difficult to capture using conventional photography, because you end up recording either the lighting or the camera equipment that you're using to record it. This is a much smaller 18th century copper printing plate, and it depicts scenes from Rome. It's one of a series of 12 copper plates, and we don't exactly know when it was made. We think it's probably slightly earlier, probably at the beginning of the 18th century. But what you find with engravings of this kind is that very often there are designs on the back as well. So this is reasonably easy to see, and we could probably capture that using conventional photography. But on the back, we have a very shallow etching, which is almost impossible to see because it's degraded over the last 300 years. And so we need to find a technology to record this in a better way. But here we can see a render of the 3D surface of the same plates. It's very difficult to see because of the condition and because the etch design is incredibly shallow. As you can see, the 3D render made with the new recording system has revealed the design in astonishing detail. What was previously impossible to capture has now been successfully recorded. In this case, a woman with Medusa-like hair. Take a look at two other plates from the same series. We can see that these also have etchings on the reverse. This is the engraved side, and this is the etched side. And again, the new ARCHiOx recording has made this side far easier to see. Here is the third engraving at the reverse with the etching, which shows the legs of the figure. It's clear that these three etchings form a group. By positioning them next to each other, we can see that they would have originally formed a single, much larger plate, which was cut up so that the copper could be reused. In fact, this design would have predated the small engravings of Rome. There are no prints from this etching. This is the first time in perhaps 3 centuries that we've been able to see what the design would have looked like. And this reconstruction has been made possible through the new recording system being used at the Bodleian. Of course, if prints were made using the plate, the etching would have produced a mirror of the image here. But what's particularly odd is that the text which you see in the banner showing the words "to NVIDIA" would therefore have been reproduced back to front. So perhaps this original was never intended to be used to make prints. Perhaps we'll never know, but at least we can now see the design. Let's take a look at another copper printing plate, possibly from the early 18th century. And as before, over 300 years, it's become heavily corroded. And again, it's become very difficult to see. But again, if we remove the tone and the color, and instead just look at the 3D surface of the plate, the engraving is revealed. What's even more exciting is to turn this printing plate over and record the back. We know very little about the front of this particular plate, let alone the reverse. From this color image, we can see some horizontal lines, but not a lot more. The 3D recording, we can begin to see markings, which were impossible to see from the conventional recording. In this case, musical notes and words. And if we add some of the original color back in and enhance and mirror the printing plate to make it easier to read, we're now able to see enough details that we can annotate over the markings, which can then be tidied up. And finally, with the image removed, we can now see the full design, which is a piece of music likely to have been inspired by Psalm 9, which is a brand new discovery made through 3D recording. The data which is being captured isn't just being used to make 2D images which show the surface of an original. The recordings are truly three-dimensional. This brings us to the second purpose of making 3D recordings, the possibility to create 3D facsimiles. This is another copper printing plate featuring antiquarian Anthony Wood. Again, it's difficult to see. And here's the render of the surface of the same plate with the design revealed. Loading into software a single grayscale image which stores the height of the surface of the plate at each pixel, it's possible to see the recording in a different way. Now we can navigate over the surface of the recording and we can zoom in and explore every engraved line. With this recording, it's possible to create a facsimile. This is a 3D printer in the Factum Arte studios in Madrid, laying down incredibly fine layers of resin, and over time building a replica printing plate. By making a facsimile printing plate, it's possible to use it to produce facsimile prints. Here is the inked facsimile plate. And here's Factum Foundation's founder, Adam Lowe, pulling it through a replica Goya printing press. This is the resulting print made from a copy of a printing plate which was engraved 313 years ago. We can now see that the new 3D recording system, which is named the Selene, can produce images capable of showing features which can't be easily seen or recorded, and that it can provide data suitable for 3D printing. But it can also do a whole lot more. With the data the Selene produces, we can take detailed measurements, we can relight the render of the surface from any direction or height. We can capture large originals in their entirety, not just small samples. And not only are these photometric stereo recordings highly effective and versatile, they are also extremely efficient. Processing, viewing, and storing these 3D recordings requires far less processing and storage capacity when compared to using previous methods. How is this possible, and how does the Selene work? Let me now pass over to Jorge in Madrid, who will tell us more about the work of the Factum Foundation and describe how the recording system, which he has designed, built, and developed, works.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, John. Now it's my turn, and I am going to talk a little bit about surface recording in general, and specifically in the experience of Factum Arte and Factum Foundation on 3D recording devices. So let me share my screen. Okay. So after the presentation, well, here the question today is that accurately studying the relief of objects that at first sight might seem flat can lead us to discover things that we had previously overlooked. In this slide, you can see a few technological milestones at Factum We can say that the processes and technology we're currently using at ARCHiOx are the result of more than 20 years of work at Factum. So if we go back to 2021, the question is, did we have the necessary recording system to undertake a project like ARCHiOx? The answer is not really. Therefore, during the 2 years ago, we focused on testing and finding the perfect system for the project. But the next question arises, is there such? Sadly, the perfect 3D recording system does not exist. Each of them has its limitations. For example, in this slide, we can see the first 3 systems we tested: the Lucida scanner, close-range photogrammetry, and the very expensive confocal profilometer. Neither of the first 2 gave us the expected results in terms of spatial resolution, and the third provided great resolution but was too slow and didn't provide color information. So at this point, we began to consider other alternatives that we had experimented with in recent years, like, for example, RTI and photometric stereo techniques. Before going on, one should ask oneself, is the difference between 120 microns resolution so important that we have to complicate our lives by switching to another technology or develop a new system? The short answer is yes, and the long one can be found in the following slides. Here, we can see the render of a Lucida scan at 254 dpi. The object is a copper plate, and the image on screen represents a small section. It's more or less 4 by 4 centimeters. On the next one, we have a render of a photometric stereo scan. It was done on 2021 while preparing the system to be installed at the Bodleian. It is a 750 dpi capture, and it shows perfectly how increasing the spatial resolution helps to see details that otherwise would be hidden. Now, side by side, comparing the results from the 2 different systems. Lucida on the left, and first Selene prototype on the right. You can see how details appears on the right image that on the Lucida is completely miss those details, like the circles. So coming back to RTI and photometric stereo techniques, we can say that both techniques are great if the aim is to virtually and interactively reveal the characteristic of an imaged surface. But for us, the goal is not to end up producing a virtual object on a screen. The goal is to recreate the real characteristics of the object, most of the times building up a real and solid replica of it. By making some assumptions, like considering that the shape of the source object is almost flat, we can use the information given by both techniques to calculate the real geometry of an object. So, having this in mind, we finally decided to use photometric stereo. So we made this decision because after several tests, we obtained better 3D reconstruction using fewer lights. Therefore, in the end, why did we choose photometric stereo and developed the Selene scanner? There are 3 reasons. One, we needed very high spatial resolution, in the order of 25 microns per pixel, which this technique provided. So the second one, color scanning is fundamental. So we need to scan both relief and color, ideally at the same time. And third and last, if we were to be successful, it was necessary to record large amounts of data. So the system had to be very fast in capturing and post-processing, both at the same level of importance. The photometric stereo was clearly the technique that could fit our needs. The Selene scanner is the physical outcome with which we have implemented this technology. We will see in detail a bit later. Now, I would like to give you some technical requirements to better understand the photometric stereo principle and the workflow we have designed for ARCHiOx. First, there is one important choice we had to make. Are we going to store the data into 3D meshes or inside images? As John told us, this is an old question, and our choice was to use images and avoid 3D meshes. Using images is the same that raster maps. And another question is how we can store information inside images. This will be explained by two examples, depth maps and normal maps. Both presents different information, not color information as regular photography, and both store this information inside the image itself. And then we are going to talk a little bit about frequency separation and why it's so important in this project, and in general when you work with relief. Okay, first, one of the first and most important decisions to be made when designing a 3D capture system is how the data will be stored. If we are talking about 3D data, we are very used to seeing images like the one on the left, a wireframe view. However, we have decided to store the data in the way you can see on the right, using what is called raster maps. Basically, this is a fancy name for a simple image, in this case, a grayscale one. And why we choose that? There are several reasons, but the most important one is that we can achieve faster simulations. For example, calculating a shaded version of a 3D model is very fast. Then we have a smaller size on the objects. For example, on the left, we can store the same information using just 100 megabytes. And if we use meshes, we can end up with a 2 gigabyte file. Finally, the fact of working in raster format allows us a lot of versatility in terms of the tool to use. If you come from the world of photography, you can use imaging software like GIMP or Photoshop. Or in the case of coming from other fields such as archaeology or cartography, we can use geographic information systems such as GRASS or ArcGIS. Having seen the advantages of working with images to store data, let's move on to point 2. How do we do this? As we all know, an image is a matrix of pixels. These pixels are numerical values that generally represents the brightness of the image at that point. In this slide, we can see how a 8-bit grayscale image is stored. In this case, brightness value goes from black, 0, or white, stored as 255. But what if instead of brightness, I want to represent another property of the object, like, for example, the slope or the height? For example, in the depth of an object, if we have to work with depths or set values, we might say that 0 represents the deepest and 255 represents the closest. Now we are ready to understand the most important feature of a depth map. It stores the height information of a surface inside the pixels of an image. In this case, black means the deeper area, or 0 millimeters, and white, the peak of the surface. In this case, it equals to 9 millimeters. But raster maps are not only for height information, it could be used for any variable. Let's talk about a very interesting raster map when we talk about RTI or photometric stereo, which is the gradient map. X and Y means that the pixel is pointing to the right or left, if we talk about X gradient, or if the pixel is pointing up or down, if we talk about the Y gradient. To simplify, let's focus on a simple shape like a sphere. What does a gradient map look like in that case? In that case, the horizontal gradient map indicates for each pixel whether the surface is pointing to the right or to the left. That is, if it points to the right, we draw a white pixel, as you can see in left image. If it points to the left, we draw black. So having seen the above, it is now easier to understand what a normal map is. And basically, a normal map uses a color image to store the gradients of the surface. The red channel has the horizontal gradient data, and the green channel has the vertical gradient. In other words, a normal map stores the orientation of a surface inside an RGB image. So that means that we can potentially, and later Richard will show up as a great example of moving in real time a virtual light around the object and having very, very fast simulation of how the light illuminate the object. Now, I would like to talk about the very important technical concept, which is frequency separation. We all know that we can add weights, like simple numbers. We can start with a sine wave, like the one shown on the screen. Continue with another wave with a higher frequency, and add the two frequencies together, getting what we see on the screen. But the most interesting thing about this is that it also works the other way around. Moreover, instead of abstract waves, we can work on the shape of objects as if they were waves, or in other words, work in the frequency domain. Starting with a surface like the one we see on the screen, we can decompose the shape in two: general topography or low frequency, and fine relief layer or high frequency. Most of the time we talk about skin. The advantages of working this way are: we can clean the noise, we can merge data from different systems, and we can focus on important details. As an example, I would like to show you the GOV map and how we used frequency separation to merge the data coming from two techniques. On one hand, Lucida, on the other hand, Selene. Lucida provides precise low frequency relief data, and Selene the high frequency one. The final model has more than 800 millions of pixels, and as you can see in the big picture, the result is looking amazingly detailed. But moving on, if we want to understand photometric stereo, photometric stereo is based on from shading, an article written by Horn in the 70s. So it's a quite old technique. In this article, the questioning was, can we recover the shape of an object based on how it looks? And the answer is yes. And the basis is the Lambert's law. Lambert's law tells us that showing how the intensity of a point depends on the angle between the surface, the light, and the viewing direction. Building on this research, Woodham in the 80s developed photometric stereo. This is a technique to create a model of a scene. So what is a model? This is a topic that it's extremely interesting. Cartographers know a lot about this. The history of maps is very rich in this sense. But if we go to the point, the main problem is that we want to create a model of an object. We take the real object and through a scanning technique, for example, taking different pictures with different lighting, we reconstruct the shape of the real object. So in our case, we talk about the Selene scanner. The model extracts two properties of the object, basically the shape and the albedo. The albedo is the Lambertian reflectance. Basically, it's the color without shadows or highlights. This technique is an active illumination method because we use controlled light to recover the surface. And in our case, controlling the lighting of the scene using 4 directions, we reconstruct both the shape of the object and the albedo, the color. This is a resume. This is how it looks, the internal of our pipeline, using the 4 input images with different lighting. We compute a normal map, and then we compute the albedo, basically its appearance, and using the normal map and a method called integration, we reconstruct the real height of the object, the depth of the object. But we are talking about different illuminations, and the question is how many we need. We can use 1, 2, 3, 40. Well, at least we need 3 with most of the techniques or the methods. Here, we can see the first prototype of the Selene. It was 2017, and it used only 4 lights. Those are the first results. Then we experiment with more lights. In this case, we create this dome. It used 40 lights. But at the end, we decide to go with only 4 lights after carefully studying, and we developed the Selene scanner. Here is for people who didn't saw how the machine looks while working. I would like to share this short video. This is how it looks through an X and Y linear motion system. The camera is controlled by the computer, taking the different pictures of the area to be scanned. We need special sensors, and the question, we only need a regular camera and some glue. In this case, we are going to present a few implementations. You can work with photometric stereo with just a regular mobile and using some torch, but the results will not be so great as we need. There are different commercial versions, but at the end, our implementation is the Selene scanner, is the one used in all the results that we are going to see today. And it consists, the parts of the system are a camera. We are currently using a Canon R5. We developed a custom flash lighting setup with custom flash lamps, some electronics, a linear motion guide, and a computer, which does the tethering, controls the motors and the synchronization of the pictures and the lighting, and also does the computation. This is the actual pipeline. It shows from capturing the images and finish with the creation of the model. In this case, as we saw, the normal map, the height map, and the albedo. With this slide, I'm going to finish the presentation. But first, I would like to share with you some results, because in these last months, we've been implementing different improvements into the system. And one of the most prominent is to increase the resolution of the system. In fact, double the resolution. Here we are going to, I'm going to present you the surface of a painting. This section could be like 20 by 14 centimeters. The resolution is close to 1000 dpi. That means that each pixel, the pixel size of the data is around 25 microns. But we've been experimenting. Let's see the details. But we've been experimenting with here the results, just the shape of the object without the color information. But if we need to go with more zoom, like for example, for some reason we have to focus on this area, at some point we lost the details. And this is why we can use a better lens and double the resolution. So here it's a side-by-side comparison. On the left, we have the system using 100mm lens, which means that we are scanning using 12 microns per pixel, or 2080 dpi, and on the left, the regular data at 1000 dpi. We can see how the details are better on the left image than on the right. If we go even increase the zoom level, we can go really, really close to the surface, up to a point that we can see each of the threads of the surface of the canvas itself. And here a section of the data with so it shows the set values for each pixel. So this is this happens like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it's the last one of the last results we got from the Selene scanner. And with this, I more or less finish my presentation.
Thanks, Jorge, and thanks for taking us through the technology. I think that last example is just incredibly impressive to see the developments in the Selene over the last few weeks. Has just been incredible, and its developments, the system and the workflow has developed throughout the year, which has been really, really impressive. So I'd like to show you some more examples of recordings made with the Selene, which have been made during the last year, during 2022 and the beginning of this year. So let's take a look at a few. So here we have another example of an early 18th century copper plate from the Bodleian's Rawlinson collection. This is a conventional 2D color recording of a heavily corroded and oxidized mezzotint plate. Mezzotint plates were made in a different way from engraving or etching. In this case, the surface of the copper was given texture using a tool called a rocker. Many thousands of tiny indentations were made from the teeth which lined the edge of this tool, and this left microscopic burrs, which were then selectively rubbed away. Mezzotint plates were capable of printing portraits which are incredibly flattering and delicate, but because of their shallow relief, the plates were not capable of producing large numbers of prints, as the burrs would be compressed each time the print was pulled through the press. The burrs which make up the design are incredibly short, probably less than 25 microns or a quarter of the width of a human hair. And this is why we can barely see the design from the conventional image. But here's the render of the three-dimensional surface recorded with the Selene. By combining these two images, we can create a composite image which contains some of the original's color and the design which has been revealed through creating a render of the 3D surface. This is the original 18th century print, which has been mirrored and then perfectly aligned with the recording of the printing plate. Here is the full print, the mezzotint plate recorded conventionally, and finally the composite image made for ARCHiOx. This engraved brass plate may have simply been made as a decorative item rather than a printing plate, as the engraved lines are incredibly shallow and faint. Despite this, the plate has clearly been used to make prints, and it's perhaps because of this that the central design has become very difficult to see. This is a 3D recording showing the surface of the plate, which has revealed the design very effectively. And for small originals, these 3D recordings are relatively easy and quick to make. The image on the render is, in this example, has not been enhanced in Photoshop. It's simply a recording of the original surface. Printing plates were collected by this man, Richard Rawlinson, 1690 to 1755. Rawlinson was a fellow of the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquaries in London. He spent 6 years in Italy and France, where he collected books, manuscripts, and objects, many of which were bequeathed to the university in 1755. His collection includes over 5,000 books and manuscripts and 755 printing plates. But these plates range in theme, many depicting people, places, and artifacts. But these plates are the focus of the researcher and DPhil student from the School of Advanced Study, Chiara Betti, who I've had the good fortune of working with. And the new ARCHiOx recordings have greatly benefited her research. All of the information relating to the plates featured in this presentation has been taken from Chiara's research. Here we can see a plate with a biblical theme. And the render makes the design easier to see. But again, we have a design on the reverse. This clearly has no relationship with the design on the other side. The theme appears to be scientific in nature. The reverse of this plate is similar. Again, geometry rather than a religious scene being depicted. This reverse seems to show preparatory markings which appear to feature heraldic symbols, a crown to the left and a griffin to the right. And in this example, we have an eagle and elements of a design which forms a coat of arms. Another griffin on this reverse. We have a portrait plate engraved by Magdalene de Pass featuring Lady Catherine Villiers, the 17th century Duchess of Buckingham. This was reputedly the richest woman in Britain and may have been the lover of King James I. She died in 1649. Contrast the beautifully engraved portrait on the front of this plate. The recording of the reverse has revealed a very crudely drawn interpretation of the same design. It has been considered this side of the plate may well have been engraved by a child. This beautiful impression, again printed from a mezzotint, depicts Lady Brandon and was printed from a plate made by John Smith. The composite image combining the albedo and shaded render has once again revealed the portrait. Of particular interest to researcher Chiara Betti is this marking, which was made deliberately. As per his will, Smith's plates were defaced after his death. However, these cancellation markings were later polished out by the printer or publisher so that the plate could be continued to be used. These signs are not visible in the conventional color recordings and do not show on the prints themselves. And the scratches confirm that this is an original plate by Smith. Those of you with an interest in Chiara's research are invited to read more online or to contact her. It's not just printing plates that have been recorded for ARCHiOx. Recordings of the prints themselves also reveal details which are almost impossible to see. This Japanese ukiyo-e print was made using wood blocks to apply color. Here you can see the impression as the paper is pushed down onto the wood block from above. Zoom in. It's also possible to see these textural elements which were skillfully applied as part of the printing process. Perhaps these can only be fully appreciated through this kind of recording, as they're extremely difficult to see when studying the original and would be impossible to record with conventional photography. I'm delighted to say that in 2 weeks' time, there will be another ARCHiOx presentation featuring my colleague, Alessandro Bianchi, curator of Japanese collections at the Bodleian, who will be discussing how 3D recordings have assisted with his research into Japanese prints and manuscripts. Beautiful painted page belongs to a 17th century album made in the Mughal Empire. Recording made with the Selene not only shows individual layers of paint which have been applied to the paper, but also hundreds of pricked holes which can't be seen in the color image. Sin Hali's text from this palm leaf manuscript has been incised using an iron stylus or reed pen before being inked. This is the color recording. Render of the 3D recording and a composite image combining the two. Zoom in. You can see not only the incised text, but also the careful pricking around the edge of this deer, which suggests that this design would have been transferred to make copies. This process of copying using pinholes can also be seen on the largest original which has so far been captured for the project, something which Jorge was speaking about earlier. Dating to the 14th century, the Gough map is one of the earliest maps to show Great Britain in a geographically recognizable form. This is the render of the 3D surface of the map, captured at over 700,000 pixels per square inch. And in order to capture the map at that resolution, it was necessary to record the map as 85 separate image tiles, which were then stitched together. This is the highest resolution recording of the map to date, allowing researchers to zoom into specific areas of interest. If we look at the render of the surface, we can see groupings of tiny pinholes. These holes are evidence that the position of the geographical features were transferred to the Goth map from an earlier map or precursor map. Studying the holes allows researchers to understand what this precursor map may have looked like and may help to date the map more accurately. Without the recordings made firstly with the Lucida in 2015 and last year with the higher resolution Selene, this research would be extremely difficult or perhaps even impossible. The new 3D recording has been used to produce a double-sided, one-to-one, three-dimensional facsimile of the original. So from a medieval map to a medieval manuscript, the illustration at the top of this folio is incomplete. We can clearly see that the pigment which remains forms the partial outline of a horse. 3D render allows us to see far more of the design. Again, pinholes around the outline, but also these incisions which would be made using a sharp tool. If we combine these with the markings from the color image, we can start to see the design more clearly. By joining the dots, we can now see the front of the horse, and we can also see that the incised markings form a harness. This is connected by two horizontal lines, which along with the remains of two inked wheels, suggest that the design may have included a cart or chariot. Given that the horse has too many legs and that there's evidence of additional pinholes to the right of the horse's head, perhaps the original design may have featured two horses side by side. This annotation, which we've just seen, comes from the first folio of this manuscript dating to the first half of the 9th century. It's a homily written in Latin with glosses in Old High German. The catalogue describes another annotation in the lower margin of this recto. Scene, barely visible, but clear enough to make a digital annotation. The design was not made in ink, but in the same way as the harness from the previous example. A sharp tool, most likely a dry point stylus, was used to scratch the surface of the parchment. These incised lines are incredibly difficult to see, and in most cases, impossible to photograph conventionally. The 3D recording made with the Selene reveals far more of the original annotation. That's the hunting scene, but also 4 camouflaged letters, R-O-D-A. This is recorded for the first time. All of the annotations together, from the color image, the illustration from the 3D render, and the newly discovered text. We now have a complete recording of the annotation, perhaps 1200 years after it was made. The illustrations made using a sharp tool have been found on at least 25 folios from this volume. We have a dog in this lower margin. Another one here below what appears to be a moon in the right margin. And text too, a capital D, similar in style to the one from the hunting scene annotation. And likewise in this annotation, the capital A seems similar in style to the hunting scene annotation. So it could be suggested that these were made by the same individual, perhaps at approximately the same time. Where annotations are difficult to see from a simple shaded render, it's possible to use other kinds of shaders, adjust the position of the virtual light source, and navigate over the surface of the recording in 3D. For each annotation, this has allowed me to be honest and accurate when drawing over them. The impressions recorded from the surface of this next manuscript might not be quite as striking as those from the previous volume, but this volume may allow us to answer some commonly asked questions. Firstly, is it possible to determine when the incised markings were made? In cases where the markings form words and illustrations, the language and style may hold the key for researchers. but technology may also play a part. Though the initial thought might be that the markings could have been made at any point since the manuscript was produced, in some cases it could be suggested that they were made even before the manuscript was written. This small region of the lower margin is a good example of how 3D recording reveals what is almost completely invisible from the color image. An interlaced pattern, very clear on the left and with evidence of a similar design on the right. Here, that annotation has been added at the exact position on the color image. It's clear that these markings are linked to designs used in several decorated initials throughout the volume. This is an example from Folio 5 Verso. This one from 38 Recto. But is the annotation simply inspired by the decorative elements from the initials? If so, it could be argued that they could have been made at any time. Or is there a direct connection between the annotation and the initial, which suggests that they were created at the same time? Hard to be sure, but if we superimpose the annotation onto the image of the initial at exactly the same scale, we find that they're very similar in size and form. And so it could be suggested that the impression may have been made by the artist during the stint when the initials were decorated. This upper margin has a far more obvious annotation. The shaded render makes it even clearer. Look at a greatly magnified oblique view. We can see that the lower line of the addition has been made through two of the letters. Not only has the incised line erased some of the ink as the incision was made, we can also see that the sharp tool used has transferred particles of dried ink to the right. From this, we can determine the direction of the incision, and we know that it must have been made after the text was written. The markings in the upper margin of this folio tell a different story. These lines are fairly clear, but even more prominent in the 3D render. Here, the digital annotations mark the exact position of the markings. But with the annotations removed, we can see that in this example, the lines have not erased the text. In fact, there is no evidence whatsoever that the text has been scratched. It could therefore be suggested that these markings may have been made before the text was added, perhaps during the preparation of the parchment. Up to this point, it's been suggested that the most likely tool to have been used to make the scratch markings would have been a dry point stylus. This would have been very sharp and capable of forming highly detailed text or illustrations. In some cases, these additions are tiny, perhaps just a few centimeters. Given that the lines for the second example have been made before the manuscript was even written, the tool used in this case may have been different. Perhaps the sort of tool used to rule the lines into the parchment. This would not have been so sharp, broader and more rounded in profile. Taking measurements from the 3D recordings may help us to validate this theory. Here I've drawn a line through an incision and a profile has been generated. Both the width and the depth can be examined through this cross-section. This gives us a very precise measurement of the tip of the tool used to make the incision. Here, the sharp tool has created a narrow and deep V-shaped profile. While the cross-section from the other example shows a much wider U-shaped profile. This is another example of a sharp incision into a lower margin. It's another case of the shaded render showing markings which are invisible from the conventional color recording. The digital annotations show two circular markings. In both cases, the focus of each circle is clearly visible in the render as a relatively deep indentation. This folio has a far more obvious example. In this case, the circle is almost complete. So it's possible that the scratch markings in this manuscript may not have been made with a dry point stylus, but instead a divider. In truth, many different tools may have been used to make the markings. Examining profiles through these depressions may be useful for grouping the annotations. This may provide clues as to which may have been made during the same episode, perhaps by the same individual. Here is a V-shaped profile made with a divider or dry point. A group of annotations made using a similar tool. Measuring the width of the lines is perhaps the best way to separate the annotations. The depth of the lines can also be measured, but there seems to be less consistency between examples. This is due to the minute differences in the pressure applied from the tool into the parchment. This is the U-shaped profile made perhaps with the tool used for ruling. Annotations with the U-shaped profile are much wider. The depth of the impressions are generally deeper too, up to 50 microns. So with these new photometric stereo recordings, we can see that it's now possible to conduct detailed analysis into the tools used to make uninked annotations. But do the annotations relate to the text? The dry point annotations recorded from this volume, from the homily which we looked at earlier, are not consistent with the majority of others from this manuscript. Here they have been added between passages of text rather than confined to the margins. Far less obvious, or perhaps only recognizable from the 3D render, is a small marginal illustration showing two hands tied together in a bow, something similar to this. In order to determine whether or how this annotation might relate to the text, this image was shared with Jo Story, Professor of Early Medieval History at Leicester University, who will be joining us for the next ARCHiOx session in a couple of weeks' time. Her interpretation reveals a clear link between the annotation and the text. From this section of the homily describes the stoning of Stephen. The connection between inscription and text is most evident from this passage, the translation from which reads, "For many are called, but few are chosen." Passage from chapter 22 of the Gospel of Matthew. This passage immediately follows verse 13, which includes the text, "Bind him hand and foot." So in this example, a clear connection between annotation and text. There are other hands to be found in the margins of this volume. There's text and strange non-figurative illustrations. Who might have made these uninked annotations? This 8th century manuscript is a copy of the Acts of the Apostles. It has been a focus of Leicester University PhD candidate Jessica Hodgkinson's research. Linking her research to my work, curator of medieval manuscripts Matthew Holford requested that I record the lower margin of this page. Here is the 3D render, an inscription made using a sharp tool, totally absent from the color recording, and believe me when I say it's impossible to see under conventional lighting. The inscription was enhanced by Jorge using a process called principal component analysis, and a digital annotation added. What does it say? This clear and complete is a name which is preceded by a cross. I'm going to resist the temptation of telling you more about whose name this is, as in the second ARCHiOx session, we'll be joined by Jessica Hodgkinson, who will tell us more about this fascinating discovery, why she asked me to record this volume, and who might have made these markings. What I can tell you for now is that the same name has been recorded on folios throughout the volume. We can even see the same name scratched into an initial on the first page. These annotations have a special significance. As well as the names, there are also many examples of illustrations. These mysterious figures. Though they may appear very basic, we should remember that they are incredibly small, and it would not have been possible for the artist to clearly see the marks that they were making. It's been suggested that these figures may have been made by drawing round a finger or a thumb. Render here shows another example very clearly. This discovery and the figures recorded from the manuscript have received a surprising amount of attention in the press. Perhaps this is because, despite the annotations potentially being made 1300 years ago, we are all able to relate to making markings of these kinds of informal pictures ourselves today. So if you'd like to hear Jessica talk about her research, please join us in the second ARCHiOx session, which is on the 7th of June. Mostly focused on recordings made from the Bodleian's European collections, but hundreds of originals from a broad range of our collections have also been captured with the Selene. The Lord Ragamala album is a beautifully painted South Asian manuscript dating from the early 17th century. Relatively shortly after it was produced, the volume was donated to the Bodleian by Archbishop William Laud at some point between 1635 and 1641. It's been proposed that 3 recently discovered paper pouncing patterns, one of which you can see on the right here, might have been used in the production of the paintings from the manuscripts. Tiny pinpricks form the outline of the illustrations, which are clearly recognizable with 3 of the paintings from the Lord Ragamala album. Pouncing is a far less obvious method of copying than pricking. Charcoal dust would have been transferred through the holes, duplicating the form of the design from pattern to page. Whether or not the 3 pouncing patterns were indeed the source of the paintings from the Bodleian 17th century volume remains a mystery. But in order to examine how closely the 2 align, 2 different imaging approaches have been taken. Firstly, using a fairly conventional approach, photographing the paintings and the patterns at the same magnification. Here, the holes from the pouncing pattern have been isolated, inverted, and copied to a new canvas. And the 2 images combined. But as we can see, not all the holes are particularly prominent using this approach. So how can a 3D recording help? This is a heat map render using data recorded from the back of the pouncing pattern. It shows each pinprick hole as a raised feature. The image was then mirrored and superimposed with the color image of the painting. Now we can take a look at the close-up to see how well the 2 align. Here we have the color image of the painting and the render of the pouncing pattern. The 2 combined. And though some elements within the designs differ, there is a clear and extremely close correlation between the patterns and the paintings. So the next step would be to record the 3-dimensional surface of the painting itself. See that the 3D render of the painting reveals no evidence of holes, and we wouldn't expect to see these anyway, as pouncing rather than pricking is the method of copying which has been suggested. And neither can we see any depressions around the outline due to tracing. So it seems unlikely the painting was traced in order to make the pouncing pattern. What we can see quite clearly are the layers of pigment which have been applied to the paper. Here is another example for which the same procedure was followed. Firstly, analyzing using 2D imaging. Again, using excuse me, using the more effective solution of combining a 3D render of the pattern with the color image of the painting. And again, examining the surface of the painting using the Selene recording. Here is the third and final example. This example shows some interesting differences. The vessel to the lower right corner of this example shares the same location in both pattern and painting, but is different in form. We can also see differences in the clothing. The outline of the veil is evident in the pouncing pattern, but does not feature in the painting. Perhaps this shows how modifications could be made during the copying process to allow for stylistic or cultural differences. 3D recordings have not provided a definitive answer as to whether the patterns may have been the origin of the paintings. It is hoped that they may serve as a template for similar analysis. And these recordings also highlight another important use case for photometric stereo recordings. Conservators may be able to use 3D recordings as an alternative or in addition to traditional methods of condition reporting, documenting changes to an original due to being handled, exhibited, or prior to and following conservation treatment. Conservation-specific elements such as flaking paint and insect damage are both clearly visible from the render and are also measurable. Virtually relighting these condition maps is clearly preferable to exposing the original to prolonged direct lighting. This is especially important in cases where the pigments used in the production of an original may be light sensitive. Being able to share these highly detailed recordings digitally could allow for remote consultation between conservators working in different institutions. Jorge and I have discussed the Selene is specifically designed for the recording of low relief originals. This is sometimes referred to as 2.5D rather than 3D. In fact, if required, the recordings made with the Selene can be processed in a way that captures only the high frequency variation. But what if we want to record originals which have more height variation, or in other words, originals which are slightly more 3D? How does the Selene cope with these items? This is one of the Bodleian's treasures, a beautifully bound Bible owned by Elizabeth I, presented to her in 1584. Even the very best conventional photography provides only a static single perspective of an original. 3D imaging allows researchers a far closer experience to handling the original than would be permitted. This incredibly high resolution recording has captured every element of the embroidered design, even the tiny seed piles below the central Tudor rose. The embroidered elements mean that the binding of this book has far more height variation than the scratched and engraved designs which we've seen in the previous recordings, but the Selene has captured these details very effectively. However, we're still only talking about the first few millimeters. The next set of recordings have surfaces with even more height variation. These have been captured from a much older group of originals from the Bodleian's collections. This is a 2,500-year-old clay seal or letterbulla. The impression was made using a cylindrical seal, and it's tiny, just 4 centimeters wide. It's in fact one of 8 seals which accompanied letters written by Arshama, a Persian prince and regional governor, to the steward of his estates in Egypt. 7 of the impressions were made using the same cylindrical tool. These tiny, unfired clay seals are incredibly fragile. Recording them as best as technology will allow is not only important to ensure their preservation, but the recordings also allow researchers to study them in a different way. Here, the Selene has been used to make a render of the surface of the 8th seal, which could be virtually relit from any height or angle, or in this case, using color to represent height. Lucida has been used to record the general shape of the seals, and then the two data sets combined for the purposes of making 3D facsimiles. But even the high-resolution recordings made with the Selene may not be sufficient to record such tiny originals effectively. Using an even higher resolution camera and following the photometric stereo workflow developed for ARCHiOx, it has been possible to record the seals at over 6.5 million pixels per square inch. Through using other principles such as focus stacking, the depth of field has been extended so that the recording of the seal is pin sharp from top to bottom. The result is this new 3D recording, where you can clearly see every tiny detail, historic repair, and even the fingerprints of the maker. This is one of the 14 letters sent from Prince Ashama. The Aramaic text is remarkably well preserved. In this case, almost all of the text has been transcribed, and the translation suggests that Ashama valued not only horses, two of which feature on his seal, but also three-dimensional artworks. In his letter, he commissions statues of horses and horsemen to be made by his favorite stonecutter, thought to be Hinzani. It seems fitting that we should carry out that request, albeit 2.5 millennia later, perhaps not by making statues of horses and horsemen, but by recreating his seal as a scaled-up 3D facsimile, and even recreating the cylindrical seal, which has been lost to time. What has been proven through the recordings made with the Selene is that photometric stereo imaging is every bit as effective at unlocking the mysteries of collections material as established heritage science imaging techniques. Given the range of possibilities which the Selene recordings permit, measurement, virtual relighting, on-screen 3D navigation, and future-proof data suitable for creating 3D facsimiles, photometric stereo is without doubt a significant new addition to existing methods of cultural heritage imaging. The end of my presentation, but we have more. So this afternoon we've learned a lot about how the Selene works from Jorge, and we've also shown you dozens of recordings which I've made using it. But surfacing these 3D recordings online is just as important as making them. Uploading the color recordings and renders is fairly simple, as these are just standard image files, but being able to interact with the 3D recordings within a browser is more difficult. And finding ways of doing this has been a challenge, which my colleague Richard Allen has been exploring with Jorge. And Richard is a software engineer for the Bodleian Digital Library Systems and Services. And he's now going to share his work. He's sitting to my right, so I will pass over to him. And just bear with us while we change the slides.
Thank you, John, Jorge, and now welcome to Richard.
Okay, so I'm sorry, you're just going to have to bear with us just 1 second while we download the presentation. It shouldn't take too long.
In the meantime, can I ask, well, all of you, but maybe Jorge in particular, about the software for the recording with Selene? Is it something that you develop, you design and develop?
Sorry, could you repeat, please?
Yeah, and the software for Selene for the recording process with Selene, is it something Factum designed or? Yeah.
We started using different approaches, but now, I mean, since the beginning of this year, I wrote the code, and the pipeline is customized by us. Yes. In fact, as we developed the Lucida scanner and all the processing that we did, that was a great tool and process to learn a lot about cameras and in general 3D processing. So with all this experience, we developed our own software.
Thanks. In the meantime, I invite all people connected to, well, use the chat, the Zoom chat to ask their questions, but also to share their comments. Or otherwise you can always raise your hand to speak. Thank you.
Costanza, I'm so sorry about that. I think we've got there. So I'm going to pass over to Richard now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk to you about how we incorporated the outputs I'm sorry about that. Thank you for having me today, and I'm going to talk to you about how we incorporated the outputs of ARCHiOx into the technology we use to deliver our service that we call Digital Bodleian. My name is Richard Allen. I normally work as a software engineer in the digital collections discovery team, and day to day I work on Digital Bodleian, the digital asset management system, and I do migration of legacy projects. But for ARCHiOx, however, I had the opportunity to do what I really love, and that is research and development of new software. And from the perspective of ARCHiOx, the things we have delivered in the initial part of the project have actually been the combined work of all the people listed here, and I'd like to acknowledge them. I mentioned in the first slide Digital Bodleian. Here you can see our team's flagship service, where we present high-resolution two-dimensional images of objects from our special collections, and this uses IIIF manifests so that other institutions can directly import and share our content, and we can do the same with theirs. And I highly recommend that you have a browse of our collections when you have a spare moment at digitalbodleian.ox.ac.uk. On a previous slide, I briefly mentioned IIIF, and IIIF stands for the International Image Interoperability Framework. And this basically is a set of instructions that allow institutions to implement the framework by delivering IIIF manifests that can be consumed by viewing applications developed to consume them. And these are referred to as IIIF viewers. There are several, all of which have different levels of compatibility with IIIF, with various features, and I'll quickly showcase them now. One of the biggest is UV Viewer. It's one of the most popular, and it has a good support for most of the features required to deliver and view 3D content. It's one of the nicer looking ones in terms of style, so it's very good for big institutions to present. And then next one we have is Mirador. It's now on version 3, also a very popular choice for presenting 2D content. And one of the good things about Mirador is its plugin feature, which I will discuss later. Relatively new one is Anona. This has a lot of potential and is very feature rich, making it potentially useful for beyond 2D, such as presenting video and audio. But the styling doesn't look as polished as UV or Mirador. So that's one of the reasons why we haven't adopted it, but perhaps that will change in the future. There is also Clover, and here it is as feature rich as the first 3 which I've mentioned, but with the added bonus of being able to support audio and video support in AAAF. And lastly, here is Ramp. It currently only supports audio and video. However, most of the other viewers don't currently support this, only this one in Clover. So that makes it a useful addition to the toolkit. And I'll briefly mention a more simple viewer called OpenSeaDragon, which actually many of the viewers wrap around anyway. And this is what supports all the annotations and tiling of images. As you'll see later, this was fundamental to the development of the work that we did. And if you're interested, the AAAF website has a bunch of these things called cookbooks, which summarize how to implement various aspects of AAAF. And this one here, the viewer matrix, does a comparison of all the viewers in much more detail than I have given today. And you can see here is a comparison matrix on the same page if you scroll down. And on the left, we have Mirador and UV, which are the ones which we implemented, which we adopted for our digital Bodleian when we revamped it to digital Bodleian version 2.0, which was released just at the beginning of lockdown. And as you can see, here is digital Bodleian here with the drop down, and we use Mirador for the experimental features via the plugins, and we also have UV viewer. The main reason we use these two is because at the time of the release of digital Bodleian 2, these were the most popular viewers, and many of the others hadn't been released yet. And the added bonus of this is that people can take the URL of an object in the viewer and they can directly integrate it into their AAAF implementation. And as a reminder, here we have some of the various derivatives that ARCHiOx produces. We have the albedo or the color map, the composite image, a pre-rendered composite of depth, normal, and albedo maps, and the depth map and the normal map. And as we know, the beauty behind ARCHiOx is that we are being very clever by incorporating a lot of 3D information about an object in the 2D form, and are therefore just surfacing images. And this is something that we already do with digital Bodleian. And as part of this project, we've been exploring how best to make these images available. We had a lot of questions initially, including who might the audience be for these and how to convey this extra information in the best way. But an important consideration for us was also, how do we do this so that other people can benefit from us doing this? Thankfully, AAAF has a cookbook we can use to create manifests that support different captures of the same 2D view. But the use case here is for multispectral imaging and not what we've done with ARCHiOx. And we implemented this very quickly as images with layers of the same view are already supported in Mirador 3, the viewer I mentioned earlier. And we decided to usually present the composite image as the first one, but sometimes some of these, it's best to show the albedo at the moment. But I think John is working on changing the composite images to make that make it so that maybe we could just present them as the default. But for these prints, we felt the albedo made a much better default representation of the woodblock prints. So we can't rely on the order of these layers being loaded in as a fixed thing in order for our potential application to consume them and know what it's looking at. So, but luckily in IIIF, there is a way to add these in via a property called context. Now that we had these images loading in our manifest, the question was, how do we tell the application we develop what kind of image it's looking at? So as I said, we're going to use context because it would be computationally expensive to try and figure this out real time by analyzing the photos. So here we came up with a way to use a map type property as part of the context. And with this, any application we develop would be able to know what layer it was dealing with. And here you can see how we used service, another property in IIIF, to add on these extra images of the same view into a manifest. We've established now that we can load many different images into Mirador, but what can we do with them in addition to surfacing those layers via the viewer? To start with, we had a standalone example, normals rendering tool, which was developed by Jorge in Java. This took a normal map and allowed you to move a torch around relating the object, but this was limited to running it through a standalone application called processing on a local desktop. And we needed something that worked in the web browser. To get our plugin to work, we would need to take our normal map and the albedo map, pass them into a program called a shader, and render our image in real time with a light in the same way that Jorge's Java application did. And to do this, I went through an iterative process of increasing complexity from raw JavaScript using a 3D library called 3JS to getting it working in the same library that Mirador worked in called React. But then I needed to get this custom code into Mirador and get it working with OpenSeaDragon. These are lots of names, and if you want more detail, you can watch our talk from December to learn more. But by December, we had a working Mirador plugin on our QA system that was loading in images through our tile server. But winding back a bit, based on our initial brief from the JavaScript application, we came up with this simple brief for the web application. It should use a compatible viewer that we already support. It should use a WebGL compatible 3D renderer to create a web optimized experience. And it should allow the user to relight and move the light around the object in real time. And the other strength of Mirador for something like this, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is the support for developing plugins that it has. So we decided our application would add to Mirador in this way, as it was the simplest method of getting it integrated into Digital Bodleian potentially. And here you can see an existing plugin, which it's meant to be a video. You can see an existing plugin which we have installed for our collection called Imaging Tools. So this is a very useful for altering images in real time through Mirador. And you can do things like adjust the brightness and contrast, invert colors, and much more. Here I'm using our favorite test object, which is Shakespeare's first folio, to demonstrate this. We use this object because of its complexity compared to other digitized manuscripts. Next point in our requirements was which 3D renderer to use. I did a bit of research and found that the Smithsonian had developed their own 3D viewer known as Voyager, and that this makes use of our JavaScript library called 3JS. So I thought that this would be a good place to start. And here you can see a scan of Neil Armstrong's spacesuit being rendered in real time in a web browser. What is 3JS? 3JS is a JavaScript library designed to make using WebGL easier. And WebGL is an API to allow people to render high-performance 2D and 3D graphics in their web browsers. But in order to make good use of it, developers need to know how to write their own shader code, which is a complete discipline by itself. And Three.js abstracts the process of working with WebGL, providing ready-to-use shaders and materials so that the developers only need to know JavaScript to start producing 3D scenes in minutes. So we decided to go for this for the initial prototyping. And using the power of Three.js, we had something written and working in a similar way, but working within a browser within an hour. However, the example I've just shown you is in pure JavaScript. And in order to get something like this working with Mirador, it would need to be able to work using React. And React is another JavaScript library. And I would argue a particular method of writing applications that is quite different to regular plain JavaScript. And this time it took a little bit longer than an hour, but after a few afternoons of tutorials, I was able to get our Three.js relighting example working in a React application. See the results pretty good. One problem was then, how do we get this working as a plugin in Mirador? But helpfully, the Mirador community already has a diversity of open source plugins. So I was able to look at them and see that they did little bits, each did little bits of what we wanted to do. And there's also documentation to get developers started with their own plugin projects. So we decided that we would take this route with our relighting example. We spent a while researching how Mirador worked and how plugins interacted with the data that Mirador was handling. And we found out that most of the stuff that we wanted to implement was actually through the viewing application, which I mentioned earlier, which is wrapped by Mirador, called OpenSeaDragon. And again, they have an extremely supportive developer community online for asking questions, and they were very eager to hear about our efforts to incorporate 3D with OpenSeaDragon. So we were able to take our nascent plugin and create a 3D overlay in our Mirador plugin using OpenSeaDragon. And here you can see the application working as a plugin in Mirador, making use of the OpenSeaDragon API to recreate our lighting tool in the web browser using a Three.js overlay. It looks good. However, as part of the course of these things, there's always room for improvement. And one of the major limitations to our new technique was that in order to keep things simple, we were loading in the textures as one file. But WebGL often has a default cap on the resolution of images you can load. And for Chrome at the moment, it's 4K. To help maintain performance on devices with little way of dedicated graphics cards, such as smartphones or tablets, it meant that our 2D renderers would only ever be 4K maximum using this technique. Not only that, our own image servers restrict single images to 4K real-time downloads. So we needed to find a way to get this image in tile form into the application. And thanks to our funding and collaboration with Factum, we were able to meet up in Madrid to tackle some of these questions together by me and Jorge having a couple hours together to tackle the problem. And here you can see the moment that Jorge and I began to work on the problem of introducing full resolution images by cutting them up into tiles. And this is the debug screen, which is built into OpenSeaDragon to help you develop with these kinds of problems. And within a couple of minutes of paired program, we were able to intuitively give this how to present this information and then start working on the problem. And here you can see a video demo of our application when I got back to England and spent a few weeks working on the implementation, loading images in Three.js tiles. However, we were still loading in the images more times than we needed to, necessitating the loading screen. And such a method might not behave well with our infrastructure. On this slide, you'll see on the left that we were, the basic strategy that we were doing, we were loading all the images into Mirador and loading them again into the 3D overlay, a very synchronous process that wasted precious internet bandwidth. if we were going to make this plugin suitable for public use, we would make this process asynchronous and not duplicate image loading work that had already been done, and make it more like the work on the right-hand side of this slide. However, we weren't the only problem. Mirador 3 itself has a feature or bug, depending on your opinion, where it will try and load all the images in every layer at once, even if you're not viewing them, which for our case would result in a noticeable lag when loading really large images. Some of the test images that we tried on our QA server actually broke the server because they were so big. And this was just very inefficient, kind of like a Heath Robinson contraption. But the good news is we managed to take control of Mirador by doing a little bit of research, and we are able to load in what layers we want. We can switch them off before the object has loaded. And this means that we can reduce the images loading to the ones that we are actually interested in. And here you'll see a demo of our largest ARCHiOx object that we have on our QA servers at the moment, the Elizabethan Bible, a very beautifully decorated book, but also at least 10,000 pixels across with 7 active image layers. It's a real stress test. And as you can see, the changes we made loading images, we could load this in almost seamlessly. Before it would just break the server, and as you can see here, it's one of the main features here was we were able to grab the images as OpenSeaDragon was consuming them and pass them directly to the 3D render, cutting out the loading stage altogether. What next? Whilst we wait to hear about ARCHiOx Part 2, when I have time, because I've been quickly put on other projects, I'm working with Jorge to write our own shaders. He's doing the shader code, which, as I said, is a discipline in itself, and I will be integrating it into our plugin so that we can better present different objects. This is because at the moment I'm using boilerplate shader code from 3JS, and we would actually like to move beyond the prototype and develop some advanced features of our own, such as specular highlights. We're also working closely with John and Factum to identify new features to add that will truly deliver the best that ARCHiOx has to offer. For your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Waiting for some questions. One is already here, but
thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody, for your lesson and presentation. I was wondering if you tried the Selene scanner, the Selene process, also for the printed books. Maybe when, in the case of what we can call blind impression, while, for example, 2 sheets are overloaded and only one was ink, and the second one was a blind impression. So I was wondering if you tried also on the printed books this technology.
Yes, Selene, thank you for the question. I've done far less printed material than manuscript material, but I have done printed material, and you can very clearly see the type into the surface of the paper. So with the tone and color completely removed from the image, you can very clearly see the type. You can even measure how deep the type is. So it's certainly visible. And also I've recorded some material for the visually impaired, so Braille material for people who are blind as well, and that's revealed some amazing renders from those originals. So it's absolutely possible. And
maybe useful to recognize or identify the text, the original text, and the original type. Okay, the text, the opera that was blind impressed. Absolutely, it would certainly show up some blind printing. There's no question. The second question is, how are the dimensions of this scanner?
So the maximum dimensions of the original which you can record, or the dimensions of the machine
The
itself.
machine itself and also for the document.
Okay, have you got the specifications there?
The machine that we can see now is 80 centimeters by 1 meter, 1 meter X, 80 Y, but you could use, in fact, last year, John was scanning and the team, the golf map, which is 150 or 40 centimeters. So you could handle bigger objects with this size of machine. Right now, we are working on another unit which has 100.5 meter on X. So as we are using these linear guides, we can adapt the machine depending on the size of the place.
Thank you.
So it's a bit
modular.
Yeah. In this sense, it's completely modular because we developed the pipeline and we are using stitching techniques which allows us to merge bigger areas.
because here at Archive we are more used to see in operation and we'll have here Lucida, but of course not Selene yet. So
yeah, it's pretty similar. The main difference is when we developed Lucida, we decided to go with a tile size of 88 by 88 centimeters. As we were recording at 100 microns per pixels, that means that we end up with 4,801 pixels in width and height. Now with the Selene, rather than 48 centimeters, our tile size is, with the standard lens, the 50mm lens, is 20 by 14 centimeters. But this is just one tile. We can, if we need to cover bigger areas, we run through, we scan using a matrix of tiles.
And this maybe is partially introducing a question from our audience asking, is Selene a good choice also for fresco, so in vertical?
This is a very good question. The first time we set up the machine, we started to use it vertically. So yes, we can do it. But at the same time, as most of the recordings were done horizontally, we focused on the horizontal recording system. And right now we are developing a vertical unit. So in the close future, possible 2 months, we will end up with a frame that we will work with it vertically.
Actually, I mean, talking about recording paintings with the Selene, it's something that I have done. Sadly, I can't share the images because the paintings, which were 2 Rembrandts, which were actually brought to the studio from galleries in London. So I don't think that I should share them because they're not Bodleian originals. And actually, I have an Elizabethan portrait over in the other end of the studio, which I hope to record tomorrow. So sadly, I didn't quite record it in time. But the results from the Rembrandts and a Dürer as well, which came in, were phenomenal. So you can see things like the preparatory markings. So that they were on wooden panels, for instance. So you can see the saw marks through the wooden panels. You can see the application of thick paint under the eyes of the portrait sitter, and also things like brush hairs as well. Things that probably Lucida wouldn't be capable of recording, because in a sort of head-to-head, the Selene is about 4 times the resolution of the Lucida.
Thank you. Of course, for who was asking the question, frescoes are usually can be very large, and so the timing of the recording will be very long, but of course the results magnificent.
In this sense, and this is, I mean, very interesting question. One of the advantages of this system is that you can play with the DPI, the target DPI of your recording. With the machine there, with John, we can play with different DPIs, adjusting the best distance, the distance between the camera and the object. So playing with it, you will cover more or less, and recording with higher or lower resolution. So that means that depending on the area, if we play with it vertically, we can cover more or less distance up to a point. But well, in that case, we could go for a lower resolution and cover more, and have, I mean, decrease the number of tiles for recording the area. But yeah, I mean, it depends on the size. Always this kind of works, recording big paintings here in Factum. Carlos can tell us, but one of the harder problems or one of the most difficult pieces to be recorded probably was the Raphael cartoons, which has 5 meters, 6 meters by 4 or something like that. So recording and then processing all this data always is something that need time and work.
Thank you. Yes, in fact, the results then justify the amount of well, time and effort, and also they are commenting. Then, yeah, it's even possible to find details like traces of works behind the work itself. So the time is well paid, I guess. And also we have other questions. Have you tried with feathers, as in feather art from Mesoamerica, and tested how the camera captures iridescence?
I think you have, Jorge, yes.
Yeah.
Not here in the Bodleian, but
yeah, we tested it 2 weeks ago with some feathers, and yeah, the system works well. We are working on it, but if everything goes well, we will run a few scans on these kinds of objects. But yeah, close fingers.
What we have photographed at the Bodleian are herbarium, so pressed flowers onto a page, and you can see the petals and the leaves really beautifully. So similar to feathers, I guess.
And thank you. And did you try, I think the question is for especially the ARCHiOx team, did you try to use also IR or UV recordings?
Sure, if you could combine photometric stereo with UV or IR. Jorge, have you got any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's one more time, very interesting question. I am curious about using, I mean, obviously we can work on a multi-layer viewer and have all this information, like Richard shown us, different layers of information, the color, the UV, the IR, and so. But talking about the photometric stereo itself technique, I know that we can, I mean, there are people that work with IR cameras, and same, and you could set up the system using different lighting directions, using IR light and an IR sensor. What you can, I mean, at the end, depending on the object, could be interesting, but we didn't test on with the photometric stereo itself technique. We did IR and UV itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't overlay an IR image on top of the 3D recording and navigate it in that way. That would be absolutely possible. It is just another layer. So it can just sit on top of our 3D data. But to record the two at the same time might be, I think that's certainly tricky with, well, very tricky with multispectral anyway, where you have to have different filters for different exposures.
Yeah.
Great. And I can't wait to check also on digital Bodleian the results of what Richard Allen was telling us, because here in the office with my colleague Lenia, we were already well fantasizing about the results and also what will be the future also for our collection. And so I've been mesmerized by all your lectures, and I invite people to continue asking questions if they have some doubts or comments, and if there is more, or you have been really clear anyway.
Well, two things to say about sharing the recordings. Firstly, there are several articles on the Bodleian's blog site, which is called The Conveyor. So anyone who's interested in any of the recordings, which I showed in my presentation, should take a look at those, and that gives you an overview of the technology as well. But Rich has offered to put into the chat the URL for the recordings which he's surfaced, which you will be able to interact with using the lighting tool. Is that right?
Yeah, this is
yes.
one for now, but we're gonna...
Thank you very much.
That's okay. I've been told there's one recording for now which you can interact with, but there'll be some more loaded shortly.
Great. You said in this chat, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Bear with me. Okay, Rich is answering that as we speak.
Okay.
Costanza, just to talk about what I hope to do in the coming year, because we're hoping that the ARCHiOx project will be funded for another year by the Helen Hamlin Trust, and that seems likely to happen. So the sorts of originals which I've suggested that we try and record are things like charter seals. So you saw the ARCHiOx seals in my presentation, which are clay seals, which are 2,500 years old, but something that I'd like to record are wax seals, which would have accompanied charters, the most significant, of course, being the seals from the Magna Carta. And we have, as I said, 4 engrossments of Magna Carta in the Bodleian's collections. And these are notoriously difficult to photograph, and they're incredibly fragile as well. So just as with the clay seals, I think that would be a good thing to record. Also, as I said before, we're going to start recording some of our paintings, and the Bodleian has lots and lots of oil master paintings. So we will do what you're doing in the Chini, which is to record some of our artwork. And also just to broaden the selection of material, in the Bodleian, which we're going to record with the Selene to see what works and what doesn't work. And we didn't really have too many fixed outputs when we started the project. We didn't know what the new 3D recording system would work for and what it wouldn't record so well. But luckily, I've got to work with some amazing researchers along the way, and they've made suggestions, or our curatorial team have made suggestions. And that's kind of really steered the course of ARCHiOx in a really organic way, which is fantastic. And it's been really, really rewarding to work with Jorge and Carlos and all of the team at Factum Foundation, who have been such amazing partners in ARCHiOx. So it's been an absolute treat. And I look forward to meeting you in Venice at some point in the future as well, to see your amazing work at Archive. So, yeah.
You are more than welcome, you all, of course, and thank you, Richard, for the link. We'll have fun later. And well, since you were mentioning now about all the researchers and all the colleagues in the also curatorial departments of Bodleian, that in 2 weeks we'll hear from some of them, and I'm very happy about it. And a question popped in my head that maybe it's not that easy to answer. How you define what should be recorded with Selene, for example? Because I imagine that it's not that all collection can be recorded with this technique. And so sometimes you maybe have previous knowledge of some hidden notes or something, but sometimes maybe not.
So the example of the name which was scratched into the 8th century manuscript, there was evidence on one single folio from that manuscript which was very clear. So an initial had been really cut into the surface of the manuscript using a knife, and that prompted an idea for the researcher Jessica Hodgkinson to look very, very carefully into the surface of the pages of the manuscript with a torch, which was she was given permission to do. And although the annotations are really tiny, when I was given the manuscript to record, I was very skeptical that the Selene would be able to record anything, because I literally couldn't see these annotations, which the researcher claimed must be there, but she wasn't able to read them. And even if she was, and she might publish her research, then you need to evidence your research. And there's an amazing sort of serendipity that this project was moving forward at exactly the same time as she needed a solution to present her data. So yeah, it was one of those happy coincidences, I suppose. But in terms of what we're going to record next, I've said what I'd like to, and I'd like to do more of the same. But I think there's been some occasions where we haven't managed to record certain features which I've been given by curators from manuscripts, for instance, redactions. So situations where a page might have been scrubbed out, for instance. I think the damage to the surface of the actual erasure, it means that there's no way of recording what was there before. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Well, what's very clear to me is that this is absolutely as exciting as any multispectral imaging that I've seen. I would put it at the same sort of level as probably radiography, really, in its ability to show things which are there, which are present, but you just can't see. So it's a really, really exciting new piece of technology. And it's complementary to other imaging technology as well.
Thank you very much. Well, we have a comment. I was about to say that you spoke clearly. So thanks for organizing this, because I'm not sure about the pronunciation. I'm a historian of art and science based at the CSIC in Madrid, formerly at the University of St. Andrews. I know Adam, Jorge, and Carlos from Factum, and we are trying to set up together a project on wood blocks. I look forward to more discussions like this. Best wishes. Yeah, my questions. Do you want to speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I had a question about the wood prints and the wood blocks, and to what extent this technology will allow to know more about the tools that were used. Have you been having these discussions about the marks of the tools, perhaps left in the blocks? This is something that is very much of interest to my project on wood blocks. So I'm curious to know exactly, yeah, what you think about this idea of reverse engineering the process of making these objects. Thank you so much.
I see your question. So, I mean, there are two things to say about wood blocks. Firstly, the prints themselves reveal an awful lot. And in a couple of weeks' time, if you can join us, you'll be hearing from Alessandro Bianchi, who is our curator of Japanese materials here at the Bodleian. And he's been looking at the recordings of the prints themselves. And what you can clearly see are the individual layers of color, which were applied as indentations into the paper. So you can see which layers have sort of been crushed on top of, behind other layers. So from that, you can even determine which colors have been applied before which other colors, which is really amazing. That would have been impossible to really see before these 3D recordings. So that's really quite special, especially when the layers are actually not even necessarily delivering ink to the page. They might just be textural elements, as I showed in a couple of my slides earlier on. But the wood blocks themselves, I've recorded just one, and that was okay, but it wasn't completely successful because the depth of the differences in height between the upper layer and the sort of engraved elements, for want of a better word, there was too much height difference to record it very well. I think possibly I think we know more about how we could possibly achieve a better result now than we did when I made that recording, which was a few months ago, because this project is relatively new. So I think we may have better ways of dealing with recording the wood blocks themselves. And actually, we have the Lucida, which is the technology which the Factum Foundation have been using for 10 years. So that might be a better approach for recording the wood blocks themselves. But in either case, you can record a data set which is capable of producing facsimile wood blocks to make new prints. So that's entirely possible.
Thank you very much again to John, Jorge, and Richard for being with us today. And well, thank you to all people participating in this. And that's been really interesting. I can't wait for next session. And thank you again, and good evening to everybody.
Thanks, Costanza. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.